Alright, hello. This is Stuart. It is November 26th, 2020. Recording this here in the evening. Tried to do it live and was having some issues, so just going to record this and post it. But I figured I wanted to read some local Native history with you all here for Thanksgiving or Thanks-taking or National Day of Mourning or whatever you want to call it. Maybe just November 26th, a Thursday. So thanks for tuning in, and today I am going to read from the book Messages from Frank's Landing, A Story of Salmon, Treaties, and the Indian Way by Charles Wilkinson, pictured here. And this was published in 2000 by University of Washington Press. This is a picture of the tree on Medicine Creek where the Medicine Creek Treaty was signed nearby. As of this photo, it said that the treaty was still there. I believe that is no longer the case. Several years ago, I don't recall if it was lightning or something storm related, and the Medicine Creek Treaty tree, I believe, has come down since then. But here is a photo of it. And if you've watched my show PoliticOly, you have probably heard me do a land acknowledgement, and one of the things I mention is that I am broadcasting from the land covered by the Medicine Creek Treaty, and so this is what that is referring to, and we will learn more about that history here tonight. So thanks for tuning in. Let's see. So this is a photo of Michael Hunt, who was arrested and tear gassed in 1970 in the struggle for Indian fishing rights here in the Nisqually area. So first of all, actually I'm going to back up to this one to read the introduction here with you. 1945. After the family dinner, Billy Frank Jr. walked out into the chilly December air and down to the bank of the Nisqually River. The 14-year-old boy shoved a canoe, a carved-out cross-section of a cedar log, into the water. He pulled the canoe upstream from a standing position, knowing the river, unhindered by darkness. Besides, it had to be dark. The state game wardens were cracking down on Indian fishermen. They knew that Billy fished this stretch of water. He made his way half a mile up the river, passing under the old Pacific Highway bridge to the eddy just beyond it. During the past few days, he had made his repairs to the 50-foot cotton net stowed in the canoe. My dad always told me to prepare for the salmon coming back. Don't get caught in a hurry. Have it done in advance. He told me about a guy cutting a net in the dark and stabbing himself in the stomach. Don't be like that, he told me. Billy unwrapped the net and set it neatly, with the corks on the top keeping the apparatus afloat and the weights on the other side of the net resting on the river bottom. With the net in place, the boy lashed the canoe to the limbs of a fallen maple tree overhanging the eddy. It was like a tunnel under there, and the canoe looks just like a log. There's no way they could see it. His work done, he strode back to his home at Frank's Landing on the riverside trail that cut through the tangle of vine maple, ferns, and blackberry. He knew the way by heart. We didn't walk on the roads. All we walked were trails. Indians have always used that river trail. It went all the way up to our mountain. He was up early the next morning, still needing the dark. He made his way back up the trail. The net had done its work, taking some steelhead and a load of chum salmon. This was the renowned late chum run bound for Muck Creek. I knew they'd be here because Muck Creek had just sent down the big winter freshet that gets the salmon going every year, and that downed maple hanging out over the eddy would give them shade and shelter. He would sell his catch to nearby farmers who would like this fresh meat. Billy laid the fish in the canoe, then folded the net and stowed it. He poled out into the current, floated under the bridge, and headed toward the gravel bar on the far side of the river. The bar was a good place to butcher the fish. He unloaded his fish and went to work, the gravel rasping his knees through the rubber hip boots. Take off the head, the fins, the tail with the sharp knife, draw the knife up along the backbone, make the fillets in the old way. Quick and efficient, but neat and respectful. The 2 flashlights hit him dead on, no more than 50 feet away. "You're under arrest!" Billy jumped to his feet and scrambled frantically across the bar toward the brush, awkward in his hip boots. At the edge of the brush he stumbled and fell. The 2 game wardens were on him and had him by the arms. "Leave me alone, God damn it!" the struggling boy screamed out. "I fish here! I live here!" This incident, just before Christmas 1945, marked the first of more than 50 arrests that Billy Frank Jr. would endure over the course of 3 decades. The moment coincided with the beginning of the post-World War II boom that jump-started the economy of Seattle, Puget Sound, and the Pacific Northwest, changing forever the lands and waters and, particularly for Billy, the river that rushes through his veins. Almost incredibly, he became a principal figure in those sweeping events, first as a warrior for his people's rights in their river, then as a statesman, bringing people together by dint of his charisma and his genius for gauging the public will and the interests of constituency groups. Yet for all his rare personal skills, Billy stands for something much larger. His eyes and soul have borne witness, not just to the epic events of since 1945 and to the time since his birth in 1931, but also to a long line of human experiences stretching back immeasurably far before then. Billy's father, a skilled practitioner of the Indian oral tradition, who lived for more than a century, painted vivid word pictures of what he had seen. And before we go on, I'll just read the caption to the photo on the screen here. This, again, is Michael Hunt. "Police assaults against Indian fishing once were routine. Tear-gassed, Michael Hunt was among 62 arrested in 1970 incident that prompted filing of a federal lawsuit to protect treaty rights." And this next photo, born in 1879, Willie Frank devoted his life to the welfare of Nisqually Indians. In a pleasure of shared moments, Suzette Mills shaves her grandfather at his Frank's Landing home. And I'll continue with the story. "My dad was a great storyteller. He was always telling me stories. I can't explain what it's like to have your parents around so long. It's a very powerful thing to have your dad live to be 104. Mom lived almost that long herself. You've got to have someone who holds us together, who keeps us strong. Mom and Dad did that. You'd think, they'll be here tomorrow. I had coffee with them in their house every morning of my adult life, every day I was in town. Dad had a shaving brush and one of those mugs. I'd go over every Saturday morning and shave him with one of those. We'd all do it. Al and Maisel, Suzette and Allison. That's not a big thing, but it is a big thing. He probably looked forward to it every week." Then, referring to one of his own sons, Billy adds, "I'm going to get Willie one of those mugs." Billy's father was instructed in turn by his father. Another accomplished storyteller. The stories, true ones, anchored Billy's mind back before the treaty, back before the Europeans, and his mind still inhabits those places. Through Billy Frank, we can learn the whole progression, which casts many different rays of understanding on these times today. And so, while Billy has been celebrated as a visionary, if we go deeper and truer, we learn that he is best understood as a plain-spoken bearer of traditions, a messenger, passing along messages from his father, from his grandfather, from those further back, from all Indian people really. They're messages about ourselves, about the natural world, about societies past, about this society, and about societies to come. Some of the messages are simple and homespun. Teach your children to take pride in their workmanship when they put out their nets. Others are profound. You can't quell the fire of Indian sovereignty by arresting Indian fishermen. When examined rigorously, not out of any romanticism, but only out of our own enlightened self-interest, these messages can be of great practical use to us in this and future years. Understood in this sense, there is no identifiable beginning or end to this story, but one place we might visit next is Billy Frank's true homeland, at the time his father entered it. And this next photo here is 1979, Willie Frank on his 100th birthday and the 50th anniversary of his marriage to Angeline, shown here at age 88. 60 years earlier, he secured his 6-acre home site under a Medicine Creek Treaty provision. 60 years earlier. So that would have been 1919. Chapter 1. Muck Creek. Billy's dad was born in 1879. A half-century of non-Indian occupation had wrought many changes to the Nisqually village on the southern edge of the Muck Creek Prairie. To enhance the fur trade, in 1833 the Hudson's Bay Company founded Fort Nisqually on Puget Sound near the mouth of the Nisqually River. The Methodists established a mission in 1839, followed promptly by the Catholics, who would be the most successful Christian proselytizers. Each year, the few farm families arrived on the overland trail or by ship. The small settlement of Tumwater started up in 1845. By the early 1850s, the policy of manifest destiny began to make its mark. An 1818 treaty between England and the United States had left the Pacific Northwest to the joint occupancy of the two nations, but an understanding evolved that the Americans would stay below the Columbia River. In 1846, the nations settled their claims, with the Americans taking control over what is now Washington and Oregon. As a result, the number of Americans in the southern Puget Sound area steadily increased. The town of Olympia, founded 10 miles west of the Nisqually River, became a magnet for shipping and agriculture. The United States established Fort Steilacoom several miles north of the river. The Donation Land Act of 1850, the precursor of the General Homestead Policy, drew still more arrivals with its promise of free land in the Oregon Territory, which at that time included Washington. Although these developments assured good farmland and bustling communities to the Americans, they brought mostly woe to the Nisqually people. As was true among all the tribes, European diseases cut a broad swath. Epidemics struck soon after the creation of Fort Nisqually. While wars and random violence would kill off some of the Nisqually, smallpox, measles, ague, and tuberculosis played far the greater role in the precipitous drop in Nisqually tribal populations, from about 2,000 in 1800 to fewer than 700 by the 1880s. And so the deep changes worked by the new arrivals were both point of the rifle and circuitous, at once engineered and random. My dad always told me that the white man came over the mountain with a Bible in one hand and a bottle of liquor in the other. And I'll pause there to read the caption on this photo I'm showing. Medicine Creek Treaty tribes reserved all lands on the reservation for fishing, and they also reserved fishing rights at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations outside their treaty land reservations. Fish weirs were common in larger upriver tributaries, as pictured here. The Puyallup Indian weir is similar to a Muck Creek weir manned by the pre-state Nisqually to harvest precious salmon. Fish passage to spawning grounds was only partially restricted. Federal officials and the churches, partners in assimilationist policy, joined in a determined effort to stamp out the Nisqually worldview. These people tried to teach us that our way of life was no good. Our way of talking was bad. Our way of thinking about life was bad. Our smokehouses were bad. Taking only what we needed was bad. Our offering back to the deer and the bear was bad. Our religion was bad. Their very names were bad. Billy's grandfather, Kloketsu, shod horses for a farmer named Frank. The Indian agent, in the common administrative convenience of the time, renamed him Frank's Indian. Billy's dad, Squally'Absch, became William Frank. The defining moments for the world Billy's dad was born into had come in the tumultuous mid-1850s, with the Nisqually United States Treaty and its aftermath. The treaties were a critical part of federal policy. Although the United States had obtained land title as against England and the European nations by means of international treaties, the tribes' land title remained in place. As Chief Justice John Marshall put it in the leading case, the tribes were the rightful occupants of the soil with a legal as well as just title to retain possession of it. Only the United States could obtain the tribes' land title from them. This meant that homesteading could not legally proceed on Indian lands until the tribe transferred title to the United States. The treaties also had the advantage from the United States side of confining Indian people to much smaller parcels of land. Creation of the reservations made the assimilation, that is, the eradication of Indian tribes as discrete societies and cultures, far more efficient. Treaty time came for the Nisqually Tribe in late 1854. The driving force behind it was Isaac Stevens, President Pierce's appointment in 1853 as governor of the new and sprawling territory of Washington, which stretched to northern Idaho and western Montana. Stevens also served as superintendent of Indian Affairs. By 1854, Stevens, then 36 years old, energetic and ambitious in the extreme, took on the task of negotiating treaties with the tribes of the whole territory. In less than a year he had negotiated 11 major treaties, most involving several tribes. From one standpoint, his mission was a success, for after his non-stop caravan had done its work with the Flathead and Blackfeet tribes in Montana, Stevens had acquired most tribal lands in the Northwest in the name of the United States. But his bullying tactics got him into trouble, causing resentment among the tribal peoples, which in several instances welled up into bloody rebellion. Stevens, who had graduated first in his class at West Point, saw treaty-making as a command-and-obey process, not a negotiation. He knew what he wanted going in and did not plan on departing from his course. The first of the Stevens treaties, at Medicine Creek with the Nisqually, Puyallup, and Squaxin Island tribes, was the start of it. Stevens announced a treaty council for December 24, 1854, at Medicine Creek, a small stream the Nisqually called Shinanum, just to the west of the Nisqually River. The principal negotiators for the Nisqually would be Quiemuth and his brother Lishai, pictured here. Stevens had drawn up the treaty in advance, and I'll pause here to read the caption for this photo. Lishai, 1808 to 1858, a Nisqually leader, had assisted a steady American move into the region after the British departure in 1846, but he would not assent to treaty terms taking away Nisqually villages and prairies. Military actions were taken against him. In 1858, he was unjustly hanged until he was dead. The story continues. The three tribes, while they never thought of land as a commodity that could be owned or sold, knew that Stephen's council would be a monumental event. George Gibbs, a member of Stephen's party, reported that the delegations of Indians, 600 to 700 in number, arrived overland and in cedar canoes, and that they wore all kinds of fantastic dresses. The talks took place out on marshy ground, the big firs and cedars on the sloping banks serving as backdrop. It rained most of the 3 days. The treaty tree, a live fir then, a snag now, still stands as remembrance. The Indian people, who spoke Salish, knew virtually no English. Stephens had an interpreter who was fluent in Salish, but the governor insisted that these discussions of transcendent matters be conducted in the 500 words of the Chinook jargon. Like Pidgin English, the Chinook jargon was a rudimentary device for trade, a patchwork of English, French, and various tribal languages. How could it possibly speak to sovereignty, land ownership, fishing rights, assimilation, freedom, or the future of societies? In one sense, the inadequacy of the Chinook jargon mattered little. Stephens had his script, and he meant to keep to it. The Nisqually leader Lashai, proud, fiery, and defiant, presented the main obstacle. He refused Stephens' request to draw a map of Aboriginal Nisqually territory. He tore apart a document identifying him as a Nisqually sub-chief. He may have refused to sign the treaty altogether. Some witnesses say he did sign. Others say that the X beside his name was forged. Lashai was incensed by the reservation assigned to the Nisqually. It was small, only 2 sections, just 1,280 acres or 2 square miles, and it lay up on the bluff to the west of the Nisqually River. The thickly wooded land gave no access to the river for fishing and took in none of the broad sweeping prairies that had characterized the watershed and the Nisqually people loved. Squally means prairie grass waving in the wind. The tribe's name for itself, Squally'Absch, changed to Nisqually by the whites, means the people of the grass country. But Stephens got his treaty signed, as originally written, by leaders of the 3 tribes. After the Senate confirmed it, the United States owned most of the southern Puget Sound and areas beyond, 2.5 million acres in all, free and clear. Stephens included in Article 3 a clause securing to the tribes the right to take fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations, in common with all citizens of the territory. He knew the tribes would never sign without it. He also had his own reasons. Fishing would feed the Indians, thereby reducing the federal government's responsibility for them. Furthermore, during the presumably brief interlude that the tribes would continue to exist as discrete cultures, the incoming white farmers would want Indians available to harvest and trade salmon. What Isaac Stephens could never have foreseen is that more than a century later, courts would be confronted with vibrant Indian societies and his opaque phraseology about Indian fishing rights. Those judges would carefully note that Stephens had controlled the negotiations, had conducted them in the Chinook jargon rather than in tribal languages, and had written down the promises in English. The judges would further reason that because the tribes had the right to fish before the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854, and because the United States has a trustee's duty to protect the tribes, any relinquishment of their rights would require circumstances far more convincing of tribal intent than those orchestrated by Stephens. Again, I'll pause there to read the caption of this photo here. When the tide is out, the table is set. That was the stated belief of Nisqually Indians, who harvested from bountiful tidelands and marine waters. In 1906, centenarian William Wyalup tends his shoreline salmon smoking rack. The treaty definitely signaled an ending. It also marked a beginning. As Billy puts it, they tried to move us off our river, off our plains. That's where our food was, where our living was. All of our summer lodges, our winter lodges, our salmon came back here. Basically, Lashai just said, "We're not moving." That's when the war started. Lashai had a strong following among the Nisqually. He was a powerful orator with a commanding presence. He carried himself, well. Accounts typically emphasize his penetrating gaze. He was fair-minded. The Nisqually looked to him to judge disputes among tribal members. And there was another reason why the Nisqually followed Lashai in rebelling against the events at Medicine Creek. He was rock-solid right about the treaty. Leave aside that it was dictated set of words that rightly wounded the Nisqually pride. Beyond that, the treaty was wrong in substance, draconian in its implications. Forcing the Nisqually, a salmon and prairie people, onto 2 square miles atop a wooded bluff was mean-spirited, despicable. It was bad tribal policy, bad federal policy. What kind of leader, what kind of people would let that stand? The Nisqually clearly were digging in. Although Lashai had been well regarded by the settlers, rumblings among the white people began to target him as a troublemaker. Tensions moved to a new level after Stevens finished his treaty making with the Yakima in June 1855. The Nisqually and the Yakima had close relations, and the horseback messages from one side of the Cascades to the other steeled the resolve of both tribes. The Indian agent to the Yakima was killed, presumably by tribal members. By late summer and early fall, Lashai was meeting with white people, both territorial officials and settlers, trying to understand the full context and forestall violence. But Lashai was not going to let his people be moved to Stevens' reservation. Like so many Indian wars, the Nisqually United States firestorm was ignited by the confusions and miscalculations stemming from the gulf between such disparate cultures. On October 22, 1855, acting Governor Charles Mason, Stevens was out in Montana negotiating with the Blackfeet, met with Lashai. Both men were firm in their positions. Mason was spurred on by a letter from James McAllister, a farmer since 1844 on the Nisqually Delta whose name would later be given to Medicine Creek, claiming that Lashai has been doing all that he could possibly do to unite the Indians to raise against the whites in a hostile manner. 2 days after his meeting with Lashai, Mason sent out 19 members of Eaton's Rangers, a detachment of volunteers, to bring in Lashai and Quiemuth, probably reasoning that protective custody would work as a cooling-off period. The soldiers headed off toward the Cascade foothills to track down the 2 men. The Nisqually immediately learned of this march on their leaders and saw it as an act of aggression. On October 27th, the Rangers received word that McAllister and another volunteer who had been sent ahead as scouts had been shot and killed. This incident seems to have been based on a misunderstanding. The volunteers apparently only wanted to talk to the Nisqually, but a tribal lookout interpreted their actions as threatening. Later that day, a group of Nisqually approached the soldiers' camp. Although the soldiers had orders not to fire first, Andrew Laws had trigger itch. He shot down one of the Nisqually men, and the war was on. As Cecilia Svinth Carpenter, Nisqually tribal historian, wrote, Indian drums sounded throughout the foothills, and not a canoe was seen in the river. The conflict, pitched battles followed by interludes where the Nisqually, who knew the terrain better, hide out in the deep woods, went on for more than 8 months. Lashai, who probably had never had who probably never had more than 300 troops, developed a disciplined military force. Billy's dad was born a generation after the war, but Billy's grandfather, while too young to fight, remembered the time well, and the memories have been passed down to Billy with precision. The caption on this picture is, "From the elevated snowpacks of Mount Rainier to the salt waters of Puget Sound, a recurring dynamic prevails. Waterway flows into waterway and confluences from the Nisqually Glacier and Highland Mashell River to the aquifer springs of the Medicine Creek." And as noted in the story, and now known as McAllister Springs, named by the settler colonialists after one of the men who went to who went after Lashai. Lashai trained his troops up on the Muck Creek prairie. My grandfather used to watch the soldiers disciplining their horses with a maneuver they called the wheel. The horsemen, about 20 in number, would line up in a straight row. Half of the horsemen, those on the right, would be facing north, the other half facing south. Then they would march their horses, always holding their line like a long single-bladed propeller. This training maneuver, of course, was never used in combat, but Lashai made regular and good use of it to create readiness. Lives were lost on both sides during the many skirmishes. The greatest tragedy took place upriver, where Ohop Creek and the Mashell River join with the Nisqually River. Several families, people who were not warriors, people who wanted to stay away from the conflict, had retreated to the area, which was near Lashai's native village. Except for the few open prairies, it is steep, choppy country, the rugged foothills building up to Mount Rainier, thick with blackberry bushes and vine maple. Good country to hide out in, but difficult to escape in if caught by surprise. In April 1856, Captain Hamilton J.C. Maxon and his troops came upon a small Nisqually encampment near Ohop Creek and killed everyone in it. Then Maxon and his men discovered a larger group of several families in a fishing camp near the confluence of the Mashell and Nisqually rivers. Most of the people were women and children. A witness, Robert Thompson, counted only 2 men. Maxon ordered his soldiers to charge the defenseless Nisqually families. They slaughtered 17 Nisqually and wounded many more. Billy's dad heard many accounts of Maxon's massacre and recounted them during a taped interview. Those Indians up at the massacre, they were up on the hill looking down at the place where the Mashell runs into the Nisqually. They said the soldiers came on them and the Indians all ran down the hill and swam across the Nisqually and ran up the other side, and the soldiers were shooting them from the top of the hill. There was a woman carrying a baby on her back and they shot her. She and the baby fell into the river and floated down. Some of the young got away, climbed up the hill on the other side of the river. I don't know how many they killed, but there were a lot of them. The territorial authorities finally took custody of Lashai in November 1856. His nephew, Slugia, who knew of Lashai's desire for peace, had been offered a reward for Lashai's capture. Taking his people's chief by surprise, Slugia captured him and took him to Steilacoom, where Lashai was arrested. Slugia's breach of family and nationhood soon was avenged by Wahelut, one of Lashai's most able lieutenants. Wahelut killed Slugia for his treason. And my apologies, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that particular name correctly here. 3 days after Lashai's arrest, the territory tried him for the murder of Colonel A. Benton Moses, an American soldier. Lashai's lawyers argued, in addition to the fact that he had not committed the act, that this was done in war and should not be punished in civilian courts. The first trial resulted in a hung jury. After a retrial of 1 day, a jury of local non-Indians found him guilty. On appeal, Lachai spoke to the Supreme Court of the territory through an interpreter. I do not know anything about your laws. I have supposed that the killing of armed men in wartime was not murder. If it was, the soldiers who killed Indians are guilty of murder too. I went to war because I believed that the Indian had been wronged by the white men, and I did everything in my power to beat the Boston soldiers. But, for lack of numbers, supplies, and ammunition, I have failed. I deny that I had any part in the killing. As God sees me, this is the truth. Lachai's nobility carried through to the end. On February 19, 1858, 300 people gathered around an outdoor gallows erected on a prairie near Fort Steilacoom and watched the condemned prisoner ride in on horseback. A few Nisqually stood at the edges of the crowd. The steady pounding of the old drums out in the distance, though, showed that all the people knew. The Nisqually leader's hangman, Charles Granger, had his own vivid recollections. Lachai was a square-built man, and I should judge would weigh about 170 pounds. He was about 5 feet 6 inches tall. He had a very strong square jaw and very piercing dark brown eyes. He would look almost through you, a firm but not a savage look. His lower jaw and eyes denoted firmness of character. He did not seem to be the least bit excited at all. Nothing of the kind, and that is more than I could say for myself. In fact, Lachai seemed to be the coolest of any on the scaffold. He was in good flesh and had a firm step and mounted the scaffold without assistance, and as well I did myself. I then felt I was hanging an innocent man, and I believe it yet. Some history blows away like ashes in the wind. Other history lives on as coals that smolder hot, that never go out. Once I asked Billy what he thinks when he hears the phrase, the war. Billy answered without a pause, the Lachai War. This is history that smolders on yet. So by the time Billy's dad was born in 1879, the government church homesteader campaign had made its mark. Yet the traditional Nisqually ways remained strong. Their roots, after all, were sunk deep. Tribal accounts explain that the Nisqually originally resided far to the south in Central America. As the glaciers receded, the people moved to the Great Basin, south and east of their present home. When the climate grew warmer and earthquakes shook the ground, the Nisqually crossed the southern slope of Mount Rainier and settled in the Nisqually watershed. Archaeologists have dated one Nisqually village at over 5,000 years old. Human occupation of the southern Puget Sound has been established at least 12,000 years ago, and those inhabitants are surely the ancestors of today's Nisqually tribe. It helped preserve the tribal ways, too, that the Nisqually lands lay at the far thin edge of America's westward expansion. The white population of Pierce County in 1879 was 3,300. Tacoma had just 1,100 people. Olympia, the capital, remained a dirt road village of perhaps 2,000 residents. Washington stood a decade away from statehood. The traditions also lived on because of Lachai's legacy, which not only served to inspire later generations of Nisqually, but also bore tangible results. Lachai's resistance was so fierce and so compellingly exposed to Governor Stevens' overreaching that federal officials urged Stevens to meet again with representatives of the Medicine Creek tribes at the Fox Island internment camp in August 1856. Article 6 of the treaty allowed for a replacement reservation, and in January 1857 President Pierce established one for the Nisqually. The new reservation, while it totaled 4,700 acres, 4 times larger than Stevens' original creation, was still egregiously small. Still, it was a homeland in a way that the first one could never have been. It straddled the Nisqually River. On the eastern side, it encompassed Nisqually Lake and part of the Muck Creek prairie, where Lachai had trained his men. Perhaps most important, it took in Lower Muck Creek, where several of the largest of the local 13 tribal villages were located. This included the village in which Billy's grandfather lived. So, however painful the whole progression, reservation, war, attempted assimilation, may have been, at least he never had to move his family. One time I asked Billy if he could visualize what it was like back when his dad was young, and he told me that, yes, those times in the 1880s are vivid to him yet today. I can picture my dad riding on a horse with his dad. He'd be 5 or 6 years old, standing up on the horse's rump, holding onto his dad's shoulders. They'd be riding across the Muck Creek prairie. The grass would be blowing. I know what it was like because my dad did it with me when I was a little boy, and he told me that his dad had done it with him. Pause for a moment here to note that the photo pictured here is Muck Creek. The caption says, "The Nisqually Indians built their streamside villages along the region's major upland prairies. Fires were used to burn back encroaching timberlands and to maintain cultivation grounds for staple foods, edible bulbs, berries and roots, and medicines. Prairies also provided pasture for Nisqually horses." Billy also has clear pictures in his mind, both from what his dad told him and from his own explorations, of life down on the river in the late 19th century. The salmon still ran strong, and the Nisqually, unlike most tribes confined to small reservations, needed no government rations. Nisqually families consumed an average of 500 salmon each year. When I was young, there were still cedar buildings there, down by the river. There were pieces of timber, different things lying around. I can picture Dad. Maybe he'd take 50 salmon. Then he'd go over to a gravel bar, lay the fish down, and butcher them right there. His dad and granddad taught him. I knew how this worked because he taught me everything he and his granddad did, and my kids do it today. Then you take the fillets and weave 3 cedar sticks through them crossways. The stick up near the gills comes out on both sides so you can hang the fish on poles in the smokehouse. But you don't hang them up on the first day. They'd drop off the sticks, so you let them drip and dry out a little overnight. Then Dad would get his fire going in the smokehouse the next morning. He'd hang the fish on poles across the eaves of the smokehouse. The smoke comes out of the cracks in the smokehouse. How long he'd leave them in would depend on what he wanted. You can smoke them just a little bit and get what white people call kippered, or you can leave them in long to cook more, smoke more. You can get jerky if you want, hard as a rock, and they'll never spoil or rot or mold. Later you put them in water to soften. Down by the river with the smokehouse was the ceremonial house. The medicine people would use that, and you didn't go in there. They had sweat houses by the river too. The Nisqually also kept their distinctive canoes, handsome and utilitarian, down by the river. Those things took a couple of years to make. I know because my dad showed me how, and I've made them. You have to go to the log jams in the spring and find the right tree, one of the small cedars that washed down the river. Then you've got to let it sit and dry in the shade, not in the sun. Then you do all the cutting and hollowing and carving. The residential area was on the prairie, up above the river. My dad lived in a cedar home. They took a big tree struck by lightning. The grain was straight as can be. They'd use a stone wedge and a mallet to make a crack, then they'd split it into a perfect plank, 30, 40, 50 feet long. You didn't even have a knot in those old-growth trees. We had everything back when Dad was a boy. The hunters would come back with furs and skins and meat. The Sound was close, only 8 miles downriver. Dad would take a canoe down to the mud flats at low tide for clams, oysters, geoducks. He'd always say, "When the tide goes out, our table is set." Muck Creek Prairie was a source of both food and majesty. They knew how to burn the prairies without burning the woods. Today they call it controlled burns. It was magic. They'd burn it so the potatoes and onions and carrots would come up next spring. That beautiful prairie. And our mountain is sticking up off the side. By the side. The caption for this photo here is Ferryman Sam Piello in 1905 pulls his flat shovel-nosed cedar canoe in the Nisqually River adjoining Muck Creek Prairie. Nearby is Willie Frank's 1884 reservation family allotment and home village. The Nisqually went up the watershed to the flanks of Mount Rainier in the fall. The huckleberries were the main objective, but exploration and discovery were part of it too. Dad used to go up our mountain every fall. The mountain was alive. There were hot spots on the mountain. Dad wasn't a scientist. He didn't know about thermal things. He didn't use that kind of language. But they visited the thermal springs, and they actually walked inside the glacier. Big holes. They wanted to know what was in there. Big chunks of ice inside the mountain. That's where the river starts. A special place. He talked about it. His dad talked about it. With all its diversity, life revolved around the salmon. Muck Creek was home to one of the Northwest's great chum salmon runs. Most of the rivers don't have any runs in December, January, and February, but Muck Creek had a large spring up above Dad's village. This spring will pop up maybe around Christmas, maybe the first week in January. Boom, all this water comes out and starts flowing to the river. The chum salmon are waiting for it and will head straight toward Muck Creek in that spring. Billy often recounts that his dad, telling of the Nisqually watershed of his youth, always called it paradise. I gained some small understanding of this on an early autumn daybreak hike on the 6-mile trail that encircles the Nisqually Delta. Today it is a national wildlife refuge. I have rarely been surrounded by such a profusion of natural plenty. Nearly a dozen flocks of Canada geese came honking in. I passed at least 20 blue heron and many more mallards. Blackberries, salmonberries, and blueberries ripened. 2 harriers perched on snags waiting for voles. A clutch of harbor seals worked the lower mile of the river, knowing the fall Chinook were coming in. The mist lifted with the incoming sun. And as Billy puts it, now our mountain is sticking up over there. I had the delta all to myself. I began thinking about Billy's dad's words. Yes, paradise. But as I hiked on the edge of the broad, low tide, thick-smelling mud flats, it became ever clearer to me what he meant. For Americans today, when the word is used outside of a religious context, paradise means a strikingly beautiful place, a place that endures in our memory. But we leave paradise. We leave many paradises. Later that morning, I would be off to my duties. For Billy's dad, paradise, from this delta up the river and its valley and its prairies to the mountain where the river is born, was a homeland so generous that it gave you everything you and your family could possibly need. It filled a person completely up, and you were part of it, not separate. You were umbilically connected to paradise. Just one paradise. You didn't go off to other duties. You couldn't. You were connected. You learn a lot about this from Billy's dad's first experience with the white man's school. The Indian agents pressured all the parents to send their kids off to federal boarding school. And I'll pause there to share this map here that was drawn. Hang on, let me credit it here. The maps are drawn by Diane Sylvain. So this is the lower Nisqually watershed. You've got Puget Sound up on the top left there, Nisqually Reach, the Delta. That's where the Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge is now. Frank's Landing is nearby. Just to the left you have Medicine Creek, now called McAllister Creek. And McAllister Springs. Here in the middle, the present-day Nisqually Reservation with Muck Creek and so on that we've been reading about. Muck Creek here, Nisqually River here, Fort Lewis just north. So, sorry the picture is a little blurry on that one. But I will put a link below in the description to where you can buy this book, because I'm just kind of sharing a few of the photos and not in high resolution scans or anything like that. So to really enjoy all these pictures I'm sharing and more, you're going to have to buy the book and take a look yourself, and I will link it in the description. Continue. When Billy's dad was 6, his father reluctantly took him some 40 miles on horseback, out of the Nisqually watershed up past Tacoma to the boarding school in Federal Way. 2 weeks later, the father, upon going back up to the school to visit, was told, "Your son's not here." It turned out the boy had just left with George LaPlate, a schoolmate from Chehalis. Billy's dad made it all the way back home on foot. It took him 2 days. I'll change here to the next picture. This is Willie Frank at a 1910 hop-picking encampment, standing behind his aunt, niece, and sister. Hop-picking fostered spirited intertribal bone gambling and joyful family reunions. Now you tell me, Billy says, did that little guy know this country? Hell, he'd been all over this country. They didn't go toward Canada. They knew where they were all the time. He got home to Muck Creek and his friend kept going to Chehalis. He always taught me, you never get lost. Always follow the water. The water will get bigger. Creek, stream, river, sound, ocean. Billy's dad returned to grade school for a few years, but his life was back home. Dad had a wagon and a horse on Muck Creek. If you had a wagon and a horse, you were rich. You could go up to Tahoula and haul the fish to market in Aberdeen and Moclips, Gray's Harbor. He had everything. One time a guy asked my dad what his social security number was. That didn't make any sense to my dad. He said, "Why would I need some number?" Then the guy asked how he made a living. My dad said, "I don't need to make a living, I just fish." In 1931, Billy's dad and his mom, Angeline, had their only child, William Frank Jr., Billy Frank. Although his mother and father could never have imagined the life that Billy would lead, they could tell early on that this boy, smart, athletic, outgoing, and energetic, as well as a considerable hellraiser, had a spark in him. Billy grew up around Nisqually speakers, but he learned the majority language as well, and one guesses that his favorite parts of it come in the shade of blue. His discourse, liberally dusted as it is with hells, Jesuses, and goddammits, organic parts of his spirited and easygoing way of communicating. Billy went through 9th grade, but his real education was with the salmon people and the river, always the river. But he did not grow up on the village on the edge of Muck Creek Prairie. By 1916, the pressures built toward World War I. The United States rapidly increased its military readiness. Army posts were plums, and Tacoma wanted one. Farm, forest, and prairie land in the lower Nisqually Valley would make a perfect site. This included Muck Creek Prairie and the Indian lands down by the river. The base would be 60,000 acres or more, of which Indian lands were but a small part. In that sense, Tacoma and the United States Army were not targeting the Nisqually Reservation, but they failed to heed the special character of the Indian lands. The lands had been promised by a treaty. They were held in trust by the United States of America. Pierce County filed the condemnation proceedings and then transferred the lands to the Army as part of Fort Lewis. This was proper for the private lands, but flatly illegal for the Nisqually Reservation. Federal agencies, much less counties, have no right to condemn Indian trust lands unless Congress expressly authorizes it, which Congress had not done. Illegal though the Pierce County condemnation was, the military did not even wait for its conclusion. As one account explains, in the winter of 1917, the United States Army moved in trespass upon the lands of the Nisqually. Indian families were summarily ordered to leave their homes and not return until advised of permission to do so. Some families were loaded up on wagons and transported to other parts of the Nisqually River Valley and left to find shelter among trees or makeshift protections against the weather. Congress called for an investigation, which was completed in 1920. The Secretary of the Interior wrote, "I am still of the opinion that it would be unwise to obtain these lands by condemnation, and evict the Indians therefrom, who would no doubt strongly object to removing from their homes." The Secretaries of War and the Interior both emphasized the patriotism of the Nisqually. "We feel very strongly that the splendid spirit manifested by the Indians in promptly surrendering their old homes, of inestimable value to them, and to aid our country, should not go unnoticed. But the Nisqually of the 1910s, dispirited, disorganized, and dispossessed, had no way to fight back as they had done in the 1850s, and as they would do again in the 1960s and beyond. The land was never restored. Congress ratified the condemnation and set up a small fund for replacement land. Fort Lewis now had 2/3 of the reservation. This removal from their homes in the dead of winter shattered the lives of the Nisqually. Many fled the area to the homes of relatives at Puyallup, Chehalis, or Quinault. Some suffered pneumonia. Josephine Pope, the wife of Billy's dad, died within a year. Later, in 1928, he married Angeline. All of a sudden, they said to my dad, "You don't have a place to live anymore." That and losing his wife must have been a blow to the young man he was. But he wasn't going to give up. He was a steady, quiet guy. He didn't look for trouble. I tell Willie this: you go around trouble. Go around it. So he walked around looking for land. He lived in a tent down by the mouth of the river for a couple of years. Finally, in 1919, he decided on 6 acres along the river. It was owned by a farmer, Wint Bennett, and he sold it to my dad. That place became known as Frank's Landing. How do you have the patience to deal with these people? You've been crapped on time and time again. How do you do it? His patience was in his bringing up, in the carving of the canoes, living near that river with all that water going by him, the salmon coming back every year. All right, and that is chapter 1 of Messages from Frank's Landing. Can't read the whole book in one go, so that is chapter 1 there, and I will perhaps do chapter 2 tomorrow, or otherwise soon. So really appreciate it if you tuned in. It's really important to me to learn about the local history of our area. I mean, this is really not so long ago, right? And not so many generations ago. And we learn that by listening to these stories. So rest in peace to Chief Lashai, first of all, who we need to find a way to truly honor his legacy here. Many of the names here in this area are colonizer names, right? And we need to honor people like Chief Lashai. Rest in peace to Willie Frank, and his wife Angeline, pictured here as well. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that Thanksgiving, so to speak, story time, and hope you like the video, share it, and appreciate you boosting that so more folks in the area know more of the history of this area that we live in, and stay tuned for more. So subscribe to the channel, and this is I do a weekly talk show about news and politics, typically posted on Sundays. But so subscribe to the channel, tune in, and I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and I'll continue to read the rest of this book, and then you can also comment what I should read next, maybe, if you have a suggestion. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, and have a good evening.